Well, hi everybody. This is John J. Singleton, and I want to do an overview of the types of services that I provide to people. I know that when people hear my interviews, they call me and we discuss their specific situation, and then the conversation usually leads into the question of what is it that you do, because I don't have titles next to my name. I'm not a bar member. I'm not an accountant. But I can speak the language and I can use some of the information to solve people's problems. So I'll just tell you from the beginning. I started doing this work, which I'll describe as best as I can, in the early 90s in college. And I was just looking for a business to get into. And while I was in college, I had developed a game strategy, a game series that I could use to teach fourth graders high school algebra. And my professor challenged me to actually produce the material and make it into something that I could go into production with. So I did that, and I went to the schools and I taught the fourth graders high school algebra, and the teachers were surprised, and it was a pretty clever trick. And then I did some more research to see if it was worth getting into, and I decided not to do that at that time because I felt like there was too much competition. I didn't want to get into that market, although it probably would have done well. It just wasn't the thing I wanted to do. I wasn't passionate about it. And then I started looking at consumer debt. And of course I had at that time no legal training. I have still no formal legal training. But what I was able to do was read. So I would go and look at consumer debt cases in no other place but what? The court system, right? So I would go into the court and I would sit there and listen to attorneys argue over cases, and I realized there was a big gap in consumers responding to complaints, to lawsuits. So people that had credit card debt would just not show up. And I thought, wow, if they would just do a couple of things, because I got myself a copy of the rules and I read them, and I thought, well, if they could just do a couple of things, or if they just knew a couple of things, it would be so much easier. They could probably get themselves out of a lot of the cases, a lot of the situations, and make it better. And as I did more research, I discovered that there was a huge industry in profiting from people being in debt. And I thought, well, that's really just exploiting people. Like I just didn't think of it as a big system. I just thought it was consumers that couldn't pay and then they had a problem. And then I realized the whole system was designed to create consumer debt, push debt on people, make it convenient, make it palatable, so to speak, long-term debt, lifetime debt, and then exploit people. So anyways, I reverse engineered the collection process. I got the books, I studied the law, I studied the collection procedures, and more importantly, it's not about really the law, it's about what the system will do. It's about what people will do. For example, people believe that filing a bankruptcy is going to solve their consumer debt problems, and really what bankruptcy has come out to be in the last 15 or 20 years is nothing but a payment plan. So anyways, we'll get into that. So my focus has been on, in the very beginning, back in the early 90s, it was on consumer debt. And I started out with IRS cases. I got the worst kinds of cases. My first case was, I had to travel to the client's house and we spent a few days over there, and it took me about a month, and we finally got the IRS to agree that there was no debt actually. And they had, in the meantime, before that they had taken all his property. That's why we were called. And anyways, we got all his property back and this sort of thing, and I learned so much in that case, and I realized there were some really sinister things going on in consumer debt. I mean, it just got so much more involved than I originally had believed. And so, so it went from consumer debt to small business debt. So I started working with people that had S-type corporations, subchapter S, things like this, and a lot of them were being destroyed by the IRS, or too much debt. And so what I would do is organize a way where the company or the individual could restructure the way he receives his future cash flow, so his paycheck or business income or something like that, where it would be unattachable. And that was my thinking. So in my early days, when I was looking at IRS situations, I used to write letters to the IRS and make legal arguments and things like this to try and solve a person's situation. And I realized that the IRS didn't really care, that there's no one there that's really gonna even understand a lot of these things. They're just there to push some buttons and send letters out. So what I figured is that the client would be protected is if he didn't have anything. So it's kind of tricky because, you know, people have stuff. People have cars and boats and land and houses and jobs, and they have pension funds and they have entitlements and stock and all these things. So over the years, I had developed different strategies to solve different problems, and basically it works like this. I look at the worst case scenario, looking at Title 26, okay, which is the Internal Revenue Code. In Title 26 of the United States Code, there's a section in there, and I'm giving out these sections because I want you guys to be able to research some of the things I'm telling you, so you can validate what I'm telling you. So section 6331 in paragraphs A and B. Now, everyone ignores paragraph A, but we'll get to that. We can get to that sometime. But paragraph B basically says that the IRS can take the property of the taxpayer if he owes money and hasn't paid, or it can take the rights to property. So I thought that was really interesting because the IRS administratively can take someone's property and they could take the rights that he has to the property. So I thought, well, if I could divest his exclusive rights over the property, then the IRS couldn't legally take it, even if the IRS could see what was going on. And the way we do it is like this. Okay, let me give you an example of how not to do it. If you have cash flow, someone's paying you money, and you owe the IRS, or you owe a creditor, there's a judgment lien, and you owe a third-party creditor, but someone's paying you cash for a job you're doing, let's say. The creditor, the IRS, whoever it is, has the right to take the money before it gets paid to you. And there's different types of, let's call it levies. These are called levies. There's different types of levies that can happen. That is, different percentages of money that can be taken. So if I give up my right to receive that money and I give it to somebody else, let's say my friend Bill, right? I always use Bill Smith as an example. So I give my money, my rights to receive the money to Bill, and now that money is not being taken anymore because it's not being paid to me. The problem is that Bill could also have a similar situation, right? Bill has similar likelihood of having consumer debt problems, and in fact, he might owe somebody completely different, and that would mix my problems with his problems, as you can see. So what I discovered is that we have some really useful tools of divesting one's exclusive rights over property and its property rights. So if I were to divest my exclusive right to Bill, we share the problem. But if Bill and I together form an arrangement, maybe it's a contract, right? A partnership, let's call it. Or maybe it's going to be a company. Let's say we both own jointly a company. And then we move our property rights and our property titles over to the company. And we can still enjoy the property and receive the cash and this sort of thing. But no longer would we individually have the exclusive rights to spend the money or sell the property. That's the key phrase. If you have the right to spend it or sell it, it can be taken from you. And these are the things I learned early on in the 90s after my first few cases. I was like, well, okay, let's just go to solve the problem. Let's not try and drag it out and bill the client by the hour like attorneys do. This is not really solving people's problems. And yeah, that's the industry standard. And I think it's wrong. I think it's unethical to do that. So here's how you solve the problem. You take your rights that are now being levied against and you divest them, you move them over to a group. And the group is another structure. It's a person. It's a legal person. So we can create a legal person. We can use a corporation. We can use a trust. We can use, not all trusts do this though, by the way. What I like to use is a limited liability company. And if you talk to me long enough, you listen to my videos long enough, you're going to figure out that it might sound like every solution I have involves a limited liability company, but it's a very useful tool, I have to say. Probably 90% of the problems I solve use limited liability companies. Not always, but sometimes it's actually a simple letter. I can write a letter sometimes or a phone call. It's amazing. I'll give you a quick example before I get into the actual structure, because we're going to get into more. I want to tell you more about the way I approach different problems and the categories of problems, but I want to give you this little brief story because I want you to understand my attitude and how I think about things. So a friend of mine, his